Welcome to the Lightwork Women podcast. We are experienced women with credibility. We know what life is like. Transform your life with our top-tier psychic and wellness services. We offer effective solutions tailored to empower you on your journey to spiritual wellness. In this podcast series, we talk about tarot, mediumship, Reiki, mental health, magic, witchcraft, and much, much more. We hope you enjoy our show. Please get a cuppa, have a seat, have a listen. And just remember, many hands make light work.
So welcome everyone. This is Robyn from Lightwork Women, and I'm also a part of the Goddess Sanctuary. I have with me tonight the lovely Renee Gee and from New Angel Tarot, and Tania Costa from Weaver of Life. So we're here talking about a very interesting topic tonight, Lilith in Scorpio. I'm sure we could talk forever, so we're keeping ourselves fairly well confined so we don't just lose our way, and but it just gets so interesting and it can get pretty juicy. So I will pass it over to Renee to kick off talking a little bit about what Black Moon Lilith is and where she's located. Welcome, Renee.
Welcome, Robyn. How are you going, Tania, as well? How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Hello.
That's
Yay.
good. Awesome. Yeah, well, look, it's a really, as you said, Robyn, it's a really interesting subject. I just want to clarify what Black Moon Lilith is, and she's not actually a moon. She's actually an astrological point. So unlike the other sort of traditional planets and celestial bodies, she represents a mathematical point that represents what we call an apogee of the moon's orbit. And where it actually is positioned is the furthest point that the moon is from the Earth. And when I sort of contemplated this fact about this astrological point, because astrology is quite mathematical, and being that it's the furthest point from the Earth, I thought to myself, that kind of sounds a little bit like Pluto. And the fact that, that black moon energy, which we'll dive into, is very Plutonian. It is very sort of underworldy. And we're talking the topic tonight being Black Moon Lilith. I just wanted to let everybody know who's listening, if you haven't figured this out or you didn't know, it's not a moon. It's just an astrological point in the sky representing, I guess, just that pinpoint of where it lives. But astrologically, it's associated with themes of femininity and empowerment and sexuality. It embodies more of a primal, instinctual aspect of the feminine archetypes, and the girls are going to sort of talk about this as well, archetypes a bit down the track. But it's very raw and it's very untamed. And we're also going to touch on that energy that, talking about the archetypes themselves and also a bit of the mythology as we sort of flesh it out. But it's an energy that can manifest itself as a very powerful force, being very assertive and liberated and sort of not really paying attention to any kind of societal constraints. And it's a celebration, really. It's divine feminine, but it's the dark divine feminine. It's the very sort of mystical. I like to look at her as a bit of a femme fatale. But it is, again, linked to a lot of darker aspects of the psyche and representing repressed desires and fears and sometimes emotional wounds. And like any kind of, mystical conversations, we always look at both sides. So it's not just deep, dark and, dirty. It's how we manifest and how we harness any energy. We can use it for positive and negative. So we need to actually harness the balance of this. In your natal chart, everybody has a Lilith placement in their natal chart, and it can reveal insights into how you navigate relationships, especially regarding intimacy and power dynamics and self-expression. And at the moment, Lilith is sitting in Libra, okay? And Libra rules relationships, which is quite ironic, but not for long until it moves into Pluto. Until it moves into Scorpio. But interestingly enough, at the moment, it is squaring Pluto, and that is in Aquarius. So it's almost like relationships are being challenged in the group dynamic, especially between women. I don't know about you ladies. Have you experienced any of that energy at the moment?
I did
Okay.
experience today actually at work. I was kind of thrown back by it.
Uh,
But you're one of my colleagues, her response to me just asking, I would say fairly basic, trivial questions was quite, she got quite upset and almost to the point where I would describe as passive aggressive. Uh, but I held the space for her and had let her be. But yeah, it was, so that could, could be a rumbling. And I haven't experienced that for a very long time. So.
yeah, I mean, I'm very active with different groups at work, in groups out, communities, out in the field. So I guess I've experienced a lot of it. I'm not going to lie. But again, you just hold space and think, okay, whatever's going on is going on. Um, but what I also, another interesting fact while researching this for tonight's podcast is also the orbit time, or that it takes for this sort of cycle to transit. And it's sort of once, depending on the retrograde and the speed of the orbit, it's usually once every 9 months it moves into a different sign. And I sort of immediately thought, well, that's the gestation period for, rebirth, and birth, fertility in general. So there's a lot to sort of draw from with this conversation, and I find it quite fascinating. But you might want to have a look at your natal chart and see which, sign it's sitting in when you were born. And maybe when we start talking about the transit, I think Tanya's going to talk about that, or Robyn might mention it, and where that's going to be transiting in your chart in the coming weeks, because it is on the horizon. Um, so, Robyn, do you want to have a little chit chat as well with me about the mythology?
Definitely, Renee. Very interesting. I know you were talking about three different parts of mythology when we were having a little chat, and so I thought, well, you can talk about those, I guess, and I can go on and talk about the cultural interpretations of that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So when I talk about it, the cultural interpretations, I look at how Lilith has become like a feminine icon, which is very much related to her story of defiance and independence. And it resonated for a lot of people who were going for like any gender roles and gender equality. So
Mm,
it's like Lilith was very much, because of her refusal to Adam, which obviously you'll talk about shortly,
mm,
she was seen as an early example of female empowerment. And to me, that's like, it's like set the bar and set the ball rolling for like that feminist icon where she's resistant against the patriarchal oppression. So I
mm,
love that. And I thought, well, when we're looking at that, that's number one. And when we're looking at the other cultural aspect with occult and neo-pagan traditions, looking at her as a deity or a powerful spirit. And I guess that's how I've sort of worked with her. So only more recently, when I've got to know her and work with her in my chart, that I've sort of moved beyond that. But she's utilized for invoking rituals and worshipping, and obviously some of the other ladies in Lightwork Women would probably could tell us a lot more about that, which is amazing. She was worshipped as the goddess of the night, in relation to sexuality and her feminine power. And there was one thing I wrote down, which I thought was really fascinating when we're looking at her, is the ability to look at spirituality and sexuality, the divine and the demonic feminine, which I thought was interesting, the way that was written, and exploring where the conscious and the subconscious meet. Because that says it all. It's like, wow,
mm,
that real
mm.
scorpionic energy, Lilith, Pluto, just, yeah, very powerful. So I know that she has been depicted many times with the long red hair, and that's a common depiction. But they're more the cultural interpretation. So I thought, Renee, if you wanted to, and I'll join in with you if you like, but in
Yeah.
relation to the mythological, because
Mm.
yeah,
Well, the mythology is she was Mesopotamian myths. She's associated with Lilith too, and again, like you've said, with the spirit and the demonic sort of side of that sort of storyline. But these figures were believed to prey on infants and women in childbirth, which is reflecting in that sort of societal fear surrounding femininity and motherhood, or anybody that's sort of, I guess, wanting to, claim sovereignty into their sort of divine feminine. But the Jewish folklore is quite, I guess, the most commonly known, being that she's considered the first wife of Adam and created simultaneously from the same earth. But according to some texts, she left Adam because she refused to submit to him and desired equality. So that gender equality, and I can't tell you how many students that learning tarot, and we go into workshops and things that they sort of go, "Ooh, I don't like that lover's card because it's that story, that pictorial image of Adam and Eve." But of course, that's just the masculine and the feminine. But I can sort of see, especially in this day and age, a lot of young girls, not really identifying with that anymore and being very independent and more rebellious than ever. Of course, there is always going to be some women who are more maternal than others, depending on which camp you sort of end up in or fall into. But it is about independence, it is about sort of, I want to do it my way. I don't need a man to tell me what to do or any kind of masculine influence. So the Jewish folklore is, again, that sort of, I guess you could sort of relate to her more like the Shekinah, which is a feminine space within the Judean history, which I sort of think is really quite beautiful. And then, of course, the astrological interpretation, which we sort of already touched on anyway, which is about that untamed primal side of femininity, linked to the themes of empowerment and sexuality and that shadow self. But I think it's really important to just focus on that, the narrative of her saying that she's defying those societal norms, but at the same time use that power for positivity and recognize, that Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I mean, it's extremely powerful energy. And it doesn't always have to be doom and gloom and going down some sort of rabbit hole of, the negative side or the dark side of Lilith. I like to sort of look at all colours and all palettes and all energies of forces for good. I think that's a good segue into for you, Tania. What are your views on Lilith?
Lilith, I think just as a general, before we kind of move into Scorpio, because it does touch in terms of you really have touched on those archetypes that represent what Lilith holds a space for in our modern times, but she has been demonized, and but elevated to the same point, right? So there's that cultural narrative around her being, what's the word? I don't know. She's not, she's an unruly woman, that we call her the divine feminine, but, those may say she's an unruly woman who does what she wants and doesn't listen. And there's a lot of stories that are kind of very demonic, and I think they're more metaphors. And I see her as a representation of ourselves, both from a shadow perspective. And often I think people get a bit confused with shadow stuff and shadow work and I'm touching on that because Lilith is moving into Scorpio. There's a really strong narrative over these next 9 months around this kind of unveiling, this stripping away, and moving into recognizing your shadow self, if you haven't already done that. And I've done a lot of shadow work, hence why I talk about it. I think when we look at from an astrological perspective and using that as an archetypal energy, which helps us understand how to navigate Lilith in Scorpio in this period, is that Pluto square Pluto. So I'm not sure about you guys, but when I was around that 36, 37 going through that transit, that square, a lot of my shadow stuff, I did a lot of shadow work and worked through a lot of that. And, coming full circle and recognizing that those parts of ourselves that we need to acknowledge and have a voice and be, you go through so many different cycles around that, to the point where my lesson, for example, a part of it was, I was trying to get rid of, healing, processing, removing But what I learned was that it's kind of like a blueprint. You don't get rid of it. You honor it, you respect it, you learn from it, and you evolve from it. And that's the part of the shadow stuff. And I think Lilith, and particularly in Scorpio, those themes are really important in this period moving as she moves into Scorpio. And then when you look at it from your own personal perspective, we can look at, from a personal perspective in your chart, where is Scorpio residing? What house is it sitting, to give you some themes and clues around where that might sit for you from a personal perspective. And concurrently, you can even look at, the natural house of Scorpio in the 8th. So there's a few little clues that you can do to navigate your chart to get some ideas on how you might respond to Lilith. So from an archetype, I think that divine feminine, that person who has a voice and is ready to sort of face that and face the challenges that come through actually looking at yourself on a deeper level. And Scorpio is a very deep, connected, energy. And so there's going to be a huge emphasis around that. And that unveiling, that 8th house energy that Scorpio represents. And Lilith, she's at home. Like, well, as an archetype, I would say Lilith in Scorpio is, very happy. That's where she wants to be. And so I think the lessons of this Libra energy that she's moving away from around those relationship dynamics moves into this kind of much more deeper sense of self and how that energy can, expand into relationships, because 8th house is that next level of relationship. While 7th house Libra energy is about that intimacy and, partnerships, as it moves into the 8th level, it's asking to take it to the next level. It's still around relationships, but on a much deeper, and even spiritual level. And so I also feel she represents some of those other goddess archetypes, like a Hecate and Circe and, Kali in Hinduism.
Yeah.
So it's such a powerful, strong energy. And yeah, look at what's happening in, areas of where Scorpio sits, or perhaps even look to your 8th house for some other clues. So yeah, I could keep going, but yeah. So
Well, I did do a couple of like dot points as to, some of those points that you touched on as well, which are those themes of Lilith in Scorpio. There's like an emotional intensity around it, empowerment through vulnerability, desire and passion, transformation and quote unquote shadow work, power dynamics, and healing. And, I think that's one of the good things about Lilith, is that you can offer opportunities for deep-seated emotional wounds, particularly those in relation to intimacy, betrayal, and trust. Because if you think of the sign of Scorpio, it's a very suspicious sign. I mean, I've said it many times. If Scorpio had a had a song, it would be Elvis Presley's "Suspicious Minds," because they're hard to get to know, but then beneath the surface, it's like they just want to find out what the facts are. They want to get into the nitty gritty, and whether or not you let that energy in is another, definitely a lead on, like you said, Tania, from a Libra perspective, having that beautiful Venetian relationship with somebody, but then when the honeymoon's over, we've got to really dig a bit deeper and become more intimate and trust more, allow that person to come into our life. So yeah, it's definitely relationship oriented at the moment. I definitely can relate to that on so many levels. And this podcast is coming out a bit after this particular event, but I know, Robyn, this weekend you're actually hosting a Lilith in Scorpio workshop for light work women, or your own business. Do you want to maybe share a bit about what that workshop would look like in general? Because obviously this will be posted after it happens.
Yeah, well, that's actually Saturday week. And but it's talking, well, obviously talking about Lilith, but then also looking at where that point is situated in your chart, like Tanya was talking about, and then also looking at where Scorpio is in your chart to see where Lilith is currently influencing. So it's going to be a big day, but it's going to be a fun day because it will be participating and having some fun, but also looking at some of the things which I can talk about now, if you like, how we can use these energies to support us in everyday life.
That'd be amazing.
First, what I did want to say is we know she can be revered and we know she can be feared. So one of the things for us is moving through the fear and actually acknowledging the fear, of course, moving through it. And I think, as you said before, Renee, that sense of control is very important. And so it's about having that understanding of who we have control over, or who has control over us, like that power imbalance that you mentioned or Tanya mentioned as well. So I think it all flows beautifully together when we look at that. And we know she puts her needs first. Now, when she does that, she's a powerhouse for transformation. It is a powerhouse. And how could we not want to work with that energy? For me, it's like I have Scorpio moon, so I'm right there. I'm right there. It's like, yeah, I know this energy. But being so unapologetic that we can do that. Can I share just a brief story? I just love sharing stories. So
love it.
I had this just shows you how I connect with the power of Black Moon Lilith. I was having a Black Moon Lilith return. And for those who don't know what that is, it's when she comes back to the place that your time of birth in your chart. Now, at that time, I actually had a baby, which was stillborn. And you know, obviously, when we have these things happen in our lives, it knocks us for six. Anyway, more recently, I got to explore that in a different way and actually looked at Lilith, given some of the mythology all around the children, the babies, and I thought, well, it can't be about a baby being taken, or I just didn't feel that was right. But what I've gotten to in relation to that, and it's the depth of the feeling. So I lost a child, and with losing that child, I got to feel that gut wrenching. And this is Lilith, this is Scorpio, this is deep. I got that gut wrenching feeling of grief and just that whole, even betrayal in some way, but all those deep anger, you know, every emotion. If I could have ripped something out of something, I would have. But I believe that moment for me, or that experience for me, was the transformative point. That was what changed my life. And that's what got me on this journey of getting to know ourselves. And Lilith in Scorpio, we have to know ourselves. There's no getting away from it. Like for me, it was like, yeah, when we look at that as women, I'm not saying everything happens so catastrophically, but what I'm saying is it's the feeling that we have to understand and the feeling that we have to know. And quite often I've heard that saying of a still river on top with a current underneath. And that's quite often what can happen with Scorpio. We have all this suppressed energy underneath the surface, and it's like there's this learning to let those feelings out.
And there's no, you go.
No, you go, Tanya.
No, I was just going to say that, you know, a lot of those emotions, those feelings, you know, and from that archetypal energy of Lilith and Scorpio is there's a lot of it's those hidden things, you know, those, you know, shame and guilt, and they're not always valid. You know, they're often self-inflicting because, you know, you may have experienced something, what you did, and put blame on self, right? You probably had those emotions coming up for you, and, you know, they're not necessarily rational thoughts, but other things would have surfaced at that time. And that's what it does. It brings up a lot of things to the surface because, particularly in Scorpio, everything's deeply buried, and it's a bit elusive and that mysterious kind of energy. So when it comes to the surface, it's kind of like a slap in the face, like a major slap. And then you're going through the process of trying to acknowledge, well, what does that mean? And I know for me personally, when I went through my own dark night of the soul, that kind of very scorpionic energy, you know, there's a lot of things that I was facing, you know, the mirror was very strong. And I think that's where it starts melting, where you start acknowledging those parts of yourself that, and it's not like people always say, oh, it's not like ignoring it. We all know our you know, our dark side, or the, you know, the ego, or the things that we're, you know, guilty or shameful for, or whatever it is. But is as you transcend through that, I think, you know, working with Lilith particularly, and Scorpio energy, and that's why I think this transit is a really lovely space to be in. It's confronting, but, you know, the more you do the work. So for example, with me, I've done so much work on that this transit for me, you know, I'm feeling it's more about that, you know, intuitive, deep connected, you know, spirit, and you know, psychic energy, and knowing, you know, like my meeting today that I was talking about, instantly I knew even before the meeting that it was going to escalate, and it was so subtle, because it was such a calm space, and I was talking very calmly, but I could feel, and, you know, this is my interpretation, is that my questioning her, you know, because I was really trying to understand something, was she couldn't give me the answers because she didn't understand it. And yet she came up in defense. So her shadow came out, and then she deflected me, and she walked out of the room, and she canceled the meeting. And she, you know, I went back to her and said, you know, when you're ready, we can have a talk about this. And she completely dismissed me. And yeah, so it's kind of like, you know, whereas my former self might have, you know, been far more in her face around that. Whereas, you know, we were saying earlier, you're holding the space. So depending on your own journey and where you're at, you know, you feel like this energy, even if it's in a different sign. I think what's Lilith is teaching us is that archetypal energy, those through culture and time, and what she represents, is so important for not just the divine feminine, but I think, you know, it's the anima. Like, you know, there is some literature that where, you know, Jung talks about the shadow, and, you know, anima, animus. I don't know if I'm not pronouncing that correct, but I love that stuff around shadow stuff. So it's also about the masculine meeting Lilith. Whilst we're talking about it from our own female perspective, there's such an opportunity for the masculine energy to meet that in a very different way. And, you know, in some parts, we just had International Women's Day that brings up these themes that we're still dealing with in this day and age, you know, that women are still,
100%.
you know, having to stand up for their rights and have a voice, and, you know, dealing with inequalities around income. And, you know, there was an article about women, you know, that work like their partners do on an equal level, still do 20% more of the household duties, and has the emotional load. So it's really interesting that these, you know, these themes pop up, and it's a great space for us to be really reflective, and even and bring men to the table as well.
Yeah. I'd like to just go on with that, from like looking at how it can support us every day. Like, it's embracing her energy helps us tap into that personal empowerment, where we can enjoy that journey of self-discovery and uncovering the mysteries and all that sort of thing. And shadow work is profound, and it helps us confront those parts of us that aren't integrated, and bring everything together. I think during the time of Lilith being in Scorpio, just being aware of any sudden events that come up that we are able to transform on a deep level, and just take note if we're afraid of this or not, because this is where we will be able to take that opportunity to adapt to change, because I feel that's really important. And then ultimately utilizing our will in varying ways, communicating intuitively, and also with that knowing of the Scorpio as well, and stepping into leadership. Plenty of possibilities with all these, you know, amazing qualities that she has. And you might even become a good therapist. So I think, you know, that's not so silly. There's all these things that can be brought out, I guess, and the light shone on. So I'll just give a few journal prompts, and then obviously I'll throw it open if anyone wants to say anything else, but I've written these down. So what aspects of myself may have I denied or repressed? So I think having a look at what we have denied and repressed. Do we hide our desire for power and domination? Because oftentimes women can have a fear around power. So I thought that's a nice little one to look at. And how can I honor Lilith's wildness and primal power as a part of my internal process? How can I stop shying away from that? Like, how can I really embrace that wildness, if you like? So I thought they're just little tips on how we can work with these energies. And then also, I just wanted to say the warrior doesn't fight for blood, they fight for heart. And when I saw that comment, I thought, yeah, this is it. We're doing this. We've got Lilith in Scorpio, and we're going to, Anyway, so now I will throw it over. Renee, is there anything you wanted to add?
I actually forgot to mention, and we'll close just after this thing. But I also wanted to. That's a great. They're great. 3 great prompts, Robyn, and I think that should open up the comments section for anyone who makes it to the end of the podcast. I hope you do listen to the end, and maybe leave some comments based on those journal prompts, whether or not you listen to us on YouTube or Spotify. Or our Facebook posts and Instagram. So we've got 4 platforms. Take your pick. And so I just also wanted to, because I was curious about the actual glyph itself. And if you want to find Lilith on your astrology chart, it looks like a sickle, but it's actually a crescent moon with an equilateral cross underneath. So it's crossed with 2 equal lengthed arms. And the cross underneath represents earth, or matter, and then there's the moon itself, which sits on the top of the glyph, represents the moon. So in many ways it's mind over matter, or the emotional turbulence over reality, trying to sort of just ground ourselves when we are confronted and passing through this energy, because it is very turbulent. There's an intensity there, and just keep 2 feet on the ground, and you should be okay. But stand strong. I think that's what it's all about. Stand strong in your power. Be open. Hold space. If there is any kind of conflict or pushback or any kind of shadow that might be coming toward you, I think at the end of the day, if you're open and you're strong enough, you should be able to resolve, or at least stay transparent, because I think that's key. There's no point in shouting if nobody's listening. You know what I mean? Did you have anything else to add, Tania, before we wrap up?
No, I think that was a good wrap up. We like Robyn said, it's an endless conversation. So
Yeah,
terrific.
Definitely. Okay, well, I've got one more sentence, girls. I wrote this down. I've had a great time with this today. So, Black Moon Lilith cannot be approached solely with reason or logic, since it's related to instincts and its nature is powerfully intuitive. So, on that note, let's go back to the feelings. Thank you, everybody.
So
Thank you, Renee.
ladies.
Thank you, Tania.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Lightwork Women. If you'd like to find out more about any of the guests on our show and our practitioners, visit our website, lightworkwomen.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.